Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, president of LPB. For 11 years, Louisiana Public Square has been tackling serious issues that affect the entire state. Tonight is no different.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Shauna Sanford, co-anchor of Louisiana, the state we're in. Who polices the police? It's a question that's been asked many times over the years, and it is before us again this evening. The decision by a grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri, not to press charges against a white police officer who shot and killed an unarmed black teenager sparked demonstrations and passionate debates around the world. And protests were ignited again after a similar situation in Staten Island, New York, when a grand jury declined to indict a white police officer for the death of another unarmed black man.
Well, the issue came to a head on December 20th when a young black male ambushed and killed two New York policemen in retaliation for the lack of indictments. He then took his own life. The demonstrations and violence that followed the grand jury decisions have further exposed the ongoing mistrust among minority communities and the police. Over the next hour, we'll explore how big that divide is in Louisiana, ways to overcome it, and how we can all move forward after Ferguson. For 26-year-old Louisiana resident Byron Washington, the lack of grand jury indictments against white officers for the deaths of black men in Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island was not unexpected.
My reaction with the Ferguson decision as well as the New York decision for Eric Garner, it was disappointing, saddening, but not surprised.
Washington says there is an underlying mistrust of law enforcement by blacks dating back to Civil War days.
If you kind of read about the history of the police in America, a lot of the original policemen were what we call were slave catchers, were defenders of property. And from that point on, when you look at stories about especially black men and black women being oppressed, a lot of times, you know, it's police that's sicking the dogs on.
Several incidents in Louisiana's more recent past have drawn the attention of civil rights groups. In September, the U.S. Department of Justice launched an investigation into the death of a new Iberia black man that officials say shot himself in the chest while handcuffed in the backseat of a sheriff's vehicle. In New Orleans, the Crescent City's police department is under a Department of Justice consent decree issued in 2012 for a pattern of misconduct, including civil rights violations. And following Hurricane Katrina, police officers from New Mexico and Michigan came to the capital city to help with the influx of evacuees. But the troopers pulled out after just 2 days, filing complaints against Baton Rouge officers for their mistreatment of blacks.
Their complaints included things like excessive use of force, abusing civil rights, illegal search and seizure, arrests without warrants, and particularly targeting blacks on the streets for harassment.
Carl Redmond was managing editor of The Advocate at the time. He notes that it took more than 4 years and a court decision in the paper's favor before the details of the complaints came to light. For Redmond, the incident raised questions about the desire of the police to address problematic behavior.
And when we looked at the internal affairs reports, one of the things that came out to us was that they seemed more intent on process than on the substance of the complaints. They were very quick to say that they couldn't substantiate some of the complaints because the people who were involved wouldn't come forward and file complaints. So I just kind of wondered how hard they really tried to find some of those people.
After an internal affairs investigation, 1 Baton Rouge officer was suspended, 1 was reprimanded, and 3 were referred for counseling. The department also improved its community relations training.
You got 90% of your police department are great guys. You got 10% that have a problem, possibly, and that will come out at given times, but you can't refer it back to the entire department.
Fabian Blache is executive director of the Louisiana Association of Chiefs of Police. Speaking for himself and based on nearly 50 years in law enforcement, Blache feels problems between the black community and police in the state are minimal.
90% of the community is law-abiding persons who only want to live in peace and harmony along with their community and the police. It's the other 10%, the violators, that have a problem with police officers.
Blache notes that had both Michael Brown and Eric Garner obeyed the law, things would have turned out very differently.
In each one of these cases, had the individuals merely complied with the police officer, whether they thought he was right or wrong, whether he was right or wrong, whether they were right or wrong, if you comply, it never escalates into violence.
To better monitor police interactions with the public, NOPD officers have been using body cameras since March. The Monroe Police Department also began testing them in November. Marjorie Esman with the Louisiana ACLU says the cameras do raise privacy issues.
You want to make sure that there's no permanent record of people who are innocent of any wrongdoing. We don't want the government to then have a permanent database of who was where, when, and who they were with at any given time if there's been no crime committed, no suspicion of a crime, if they're cleared of all wrongdoing.
Esman also has concerns over what she sees as the growing militarization of police departments around the country.
The federal government has authorized the Pentagon to sell surplus military equipment at very, very discounted prices to local law enforcement, and then provided grants to police departments to purchase this equipment. And so they've essentially incentivized police departments to become just like branches of the military.
A 2014 ACLU report indicates that police military tactics are used disproportionately against communities of color.
Military weapons and vehicles patrolling minority neighborhoods and used against minority communities way out of proportion to their representation in the population, which does not lead to increased trust, obviously, between those communities and the police.
For Maxine Crump, who leads dialogue on race events in Louisiana, the incidents in Missouri and New York highlight the practice of racial profiling by police.
I think it's a responsibility of the department to make sure that law enforcement isn't being asked to profile those who look like the criminals, which would end up very often being young African American males.
But Crump sees recent police behavior as just a symptom of a broader problem. Whites in all walks of life influenced by institutional racism.
And much of it's been unconscious, indirect, and unintentional. However, because I didn't intend to run a stop sign, I still got a ticket. And I think we need to look at it that way.
Washington, who helped organize a youth forum on race in November, says America should be proud of how far it has come in race relations. But events in Ferguson and New York, he says, should serve as a starting point for further change.
It's going to be tough. We have to admit faults on both sides. We have to admit that, yes, there's a problem, there's a history there. It doesn't need to be swept on the rug. Understand that and then move forward.
Helping us to move that conversation forward tonight is our studio audience, which includes residents from Baton Rouge, law enforcement, and members of Louisiana's Legislative Youth Advisory Council. We thank all of you for being here this evening, and we thank all of you for tuning in. Now, we're talking about a really tough topic tonight, one that can press a lot of buttons, but it keeps coming up, and it demands our attention. And so to get the conversation started, let's take a look at a survey conducted by the LSU Public Policy Research Lab. 100 residents statewide were polled about this month's topic. 61% were white, 30% were African American, and 1% were Asian. Now, the remaining 8% identified themselves as other or declined to provide their race. Here are some of the questions and their responses. When asked how good a job police in Louisiana do in treating racial and ethnic groups equally, meaning do you think that they treat everyone the same regardless of their race or ethnicity, 51% of respondents said good. 42% said police do a fair or poor job, and 7% were either unsure or declined to answer. Another question. Currently, local district attorneys decide whether to charge police officers involved in shooting civilians. Do you support or oppose requiring the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate these types of cases? 61% support the idea, 27% oppose it, and 12% were either unsure or did not answer. When asked if it was a good or bad idea for police officers to wear body cameras, a whopping 97% said it's a good idea. 2% feel that it's a bad idea, and 1% couldn't decide. And when asked whether the incident in Ferguson, Missouri raises important issues about race that need to be discussed or is getting more attention than it deserves, 41% said yes, it raises important issues, but 51% said the issue of race is getting way more attention than it should. So let's begin there, ladies and gentlemen. Race has been at the forefront of these cases that we are talking about that have been brought to the forefront. Do you think that the media reports have overblown the issue of race, or do you think that it has been talked about appropriately? Missy, let's start with you.
I believe it depends on the severity of the crime that was committed, as far as the person who was deceased. It's like there's a lot of both white officers killing white perpetrators, as well as white officers killing black perpetrators, and I think sometimes it is overplayed. I think particularly in the case of the Ferguson, I think it went a little too far. But that does not say that there is racial profiling. I strongly believe that there is racial profiling, but I think that race is oftentimes, in this particular instance, was overplayed.
In this particular instance, I believe that race was not overplayed by the media. I think race was a factor. We cannot ignore the history. It's the history that got us to where we are today, and it drives a lot of what's going on between the police departments and the community, and the need for that relationship to be worked on and to be improved significantly. And I think that all of that has to do with the racial factor.
Mm-hmm. What about from some of our young people here? What do you think about what you've heard and seen? Yes, Francisco.
Yeah, I think in these particular two cases, race was a factor, but only because it was made a factor. Because, I mean, that's what gets, in a sense, the ratings. In Houma, where I live in Thibodeau, in Houma, there was a 14-year-old boy shot by an African-American police officer. The boy was African-American. That you never heard about that. Mm-hmm. So in these two instances, race did become a factor because it was chose to become a factor. I
just want to point out that Francisco is a member of our Youth Legislative Advisory Council, and it's great to have you here tonight. What about you? What do you think about this whole issue of race? Has it been overblown?
I don't think so. I think, like Greg mentioned earlier, I think, we have to look at, the cases that have led us to this point, and I think there have been some things that the media has done really well, mm-hmm. but then there have also been some things that they haven't necessarily touched, like look at the bombing of the NAACP headquarters in Colorado. Mm-hmm. Granted, there were other stories going on at the time, but I don't remember ever hearing anything going on about that.
Sarah, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree. I think race plays a huge a huge role in this. And the reasons why, it's not to discredit the fact that, for example, a black officer killed a child and they were not covered by the media, but it's how was that black officer treated? How were they by the criminal justice system? Mm-hmm. What's seen, what's been observed through past, incidences of police officers murdering civilians is that whenever a white officer murders a black civilian, especially when they're unarmed, there's not any type of arrest made. Mm-hmm. And that's evident with the Trayvon Martin case, with the Michael Brown case, with the Victor White case, so many instances. And the reason why there's so much focus on race is because those white officers weren't treated the same way black officers were. Whenever black officers did the same thing white officers did.
Now, you mentioned the case of Victor White, and we haven't talked about that, but that's a case that happened here in Louisiana, in New Iberia. Victor White was arrested after a fight. He was in the patrol car of the New Iberia Sheriff's patrol car. He was handcuffed, and he died, and it was ruled a suicide. The sheriff's deputy said that he shot himself, and his family says, no, that did not happen, and now the Department of Justice is investigating that case. Well, we're very lucky to have someone from law enforcement here in our audience to share his perspective, the other side. And so when you hear about these cases and you hear the comments tonight from our studio audience, what about race and how it factors?
Well, the Missouri case, I think race was probably overrated in that case, because when you figure the facts as a police officer, when you look at the fact that it was just an armed robbery and he just failed to comply. We saw an interview with Fabian Blache, Executive Director of the Chiefs Association. I was fortunate to be the chief of police, or unfortunate, but fortunate really, during Hurricane Katrina, when Gonzales was the first sign of life for 250,000 people outside New Orleans. Never was there a complaint about profiling or mistreatment. We prided ourselves that we were able to come to their rescue and provide them the secondary service they needed without a complaint at all.
Fortunate for Gonzales, not so fortunate for Baton Rouge, because there were complaints that were filed by police departments from out of state, New Mexico and Michigan, state police troopers who did file reports about violence and discrimination that they say they actually witnessed by Baton Rouge police officers. And
I would be the first to admit that probably is some profiling in law enforcement. There's no doubt. But it's not just profiling of a white officer and a black civilian. It would be a white officer and a white civilian, depending on the area you're in, the nature of the crime statistics, the time of day or night. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes into determining whether or not your sixth sense. Officers probably have more than a sixth sense. It's some gut feeling that just automatically tells them that this is something we need to watch. Okay, we're going to continue the conversation. That's all the time we have now for this portion of the show, but when we return, we will be joined by a panel of experts to further explore Louisiana after Ferguson. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're discussing Louisiana after Ferguson, and we just heard some great points from our studio audience. Now our panel of experts will weigh in. Chief Sherman Jackson has been head of the Gonzales Police Department for 6 years now. Prior to that, he served for more than 20 years as an officer within that department. Dr. Ernest Johnson is an attorney and president of the Louisiana NAACP. Over the past 33 years, he has served as lead or co-counsel on a number of high-profile civil rights cases. Hillar Moore is the district attorney for the 19th Judicial District in East Baton Rouge Parish. He is also president of the Louisiana District Attorneys Association. And Ray Diamond is an attorney and distinguished law professor at LSU. He has written extensively about constitutional law, race relations, and legal history. And so before we go to our studio audience, first of all, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here tonight. I know you had a chance to hear our audience beforehand. They've got some great questions for you. I hope you're ready. But before we go to our audience, let's begin with your thoughts on how you see things in terms of the relationship between the police and the communities that they serve, particularly the African American community. And Chief Jackson, let's start with you.
Well, I can tell you that law enforcement, we've come a long way from the times during the civil rights movement and things of that nature. Even from the last 20 years that I've been employed in law enforcement, it's getting better. And I think it'll continue to get better. But law enforcement leaders such as myself have to be proactive with the community and have to educate them.
Yeah, you say it's getting better, so are you admitting there are some problems?
Well, without a doubt.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, systemic problems?
Well, there are problems that throughout every community where the communities don't trust police officers, and some are taught that from parents or their friends, and of course when we have to respond to things, we hear it. So
me being a chief of police, it's my duty to get out there and touch bases with the community, hear their problems, and correct it, and of course come up with policies for my department.
Right. Interesting you talked about the problems from the community perspective, but what about the problems from the police perspective? And Ernest, you are with the NAACP, you are the president, you have been involved in several civil rights cases. What do you think when you hear what you just heard from Chief Jackson?
Well, I think the chief is correct. You got some good and you got some bad. I want to say that my father was the first African-American police officer in 1968 in Faraday, Louisiana. He was elected constable after the 1965 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and then he was appointed chief, not chief of police, but a black police officer in Faraday. So from that standpoint, I saw hands-on, my father, a minister, police officer, in the community working with individuals that he knew. However, as NAACP president, the problems will come to us, NAACP, because anytime there's a problem, we will get the problem. So I can tell you that we do get the problems do exist. The question about the trust of the police officer, the trust that our people have regarding law enforcement, the image that our people see of law enforcement or government will be the police officer, because that's the individual that will be enforcing the law. Education is provided by the law, but we don't see education as being government. We don't see hospitals as being government, but we do see police officers as being government. And when we have the bad come out in the public, then people have that perception.
But
we got to deal with it.
When you talk about the problems that come to you, you're talking about problems within these departments, within law enforcement.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
The complaints.
The complaints from law enforcement.
Right.
Hillar, great to have you here tonight.
Glad to be here.
What do you see from your perspective?
Well, obviously we have issues, and these issues have not developed overnight. It's been 40 and 50 years that these issues have really been developing recently here, and so we're not going to get our way out of this situation quickly. It's going to take a lot of dialogue, and that's why you have things like this program tonight. It's there's tension between the community that we serve and the police and the law enforcement community. Now we discuss this as legitimacy, police and procedural legitimacy. If the community believes that the police are legitimate, the DA is legitimate, the law enforcement and judges are legitimate, they can obey the law. They're going to cooperate. Right now, there's just that mistrust. And so if they don't believe that you're legitimate, they're not going to obey, they're not going to conform, and then you have this tension that continues to develop. And right now, the country's, particularly the Baton Rouge Police Department, Sheriff's Office, they're working on legitimacy. And they're teaching officers and doing a good job. 99% of the officers do a great job. They're very good. You're always going to have, whatever community you're in, you can have some bad apples wherever you go, community-wise as well as law enforcement.
Keep hearing this word, mistrust, mistrust, mistrust. And when we hear cases like the one in Ferguson, the one in New York, the one in New Iberia, that is still under investigation, how do we get to the point where we do establish the trust? Don't these types of situations further deepen that mistrust?
Well, it's difficult. We have a strained relationship between the black community and the police. That's one word. To go beyond that, we are locked in a cycle of distrust. Police officers see the citizens generally when they're having their worst days. They're either victims of crime or they're being arrested because they have been accused or they've been caught committing a crime. Police officers put their lives on the line quite literally every day. Every call could be their last call. They are called on to exercise courage of a type that most of us are never called on to engage in. I would suspect that communication and openness to communication are absolutely necessary. And I would also suspect that there need to be very strong disincentives to bad behavior. We have those disincentives when citizens behave badly. We need more disincentives when police officers behave badly.
We're going to talk a little bit about more about that, but let's go to the audience here. Beverly, I want to start with you because I know that you have a specific question for Professor Diamond.
Yes. In your 2013 article in the Connecticut Law Review, I read it. You talked
about student.
You talked about how most often police and the community they serve do not work together to are not partners in crime control, and you proposed an approach that included training citizens to act as a sort of volunteer police force. And I was wondering if your ideas have gained any traction, considering the 2012 shooting of Trayvon Martin by a neighborhood watchman. And although George Zimmerman did not have the type of training that you suggested, it did shine a negative light on volunteers acting in police-type roles.
Great question.
Great question. I hate those.
And listen, we have to point out that Beverly is also a member of our Youth Legislative Advisory Council from Covington. She's traveled to be here with us tonight. So your response.
Well, traction. Number one, the idea has traction. If you look all around the United States, the idea of citizens being in cooperation with the police has found a great footing. We have, what should we call them, auxiliary police who don't get paid, who work with the police all around the United States. We have other examples of citizens engaging with the government in order to perform vital services. So we already have this. Our idea, my co-authors and I, is that this auxiliary police department can be added to this process, this practice that we already know about can be added to. Not only with individuals who are trained in order to recognize crime, to report it, and to guard against it, sort of a souped-up neighborhood watch, but a responsible one. But not only that, but also in communities which are able to, either on a paid basis or unpaid basis, have security guards, if you will, who, again, with training at the hands of police, with training, would be able to advance the safety of the community. And we see this in our communities here in Louisiana quite often with neighborhood anti-crime districts where people tax themselves in order to get additional police services. Our idea is to go beyond that to enable communities which can't afford the extra taxation to be able to get extra safety.
You brought up training of these community folks in assisting police officers. I want to know how that resonates with you, Chief, as an officer. Is that viable?
Well, I'll be happy to say we do have neighborhood watch programs in Gonzales where I bring my staff along with me. We meet with the community. We tell them what to look for, what any suspicious activity or suspicious people in the area to call. But we definitely don't want to get them involved too much into that process. Mm-hmm. Mainly, we want to use them as our eyes and ears. So, and I can tell you, communities are open to it. They're happy to assist. Mm-hmm. And because no matter where you're at and what neighborhood you're in, you want to be safe. And you want to do everything that you can to make things safe. So, yeah, the need is there. I agree with the professor to a certain degree. However, liability issues other than getting involved, such as George Zimmerman, I wouldn't. I'm not a big fan of that.
Not a big fan of that. You understand where he's coming from, Professor?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the problems that we talked about in the article, that liability issues clearly have to be explored.
What about sensitivity training?
Yes, not with the public, but as in the department. Mm-hmm. You have to, there again, you have to be proactive and do training. Sensitivity training, mm-hmm. Culture, diversity, all of that play a role into when you got into these communities and how you react to certain things.
Jacques, you have a question for our guests.
Yes. I want to ask a question. How would we as a community get past this negativity into positivity? How can we come together and just get away from all this negativity?
Great question. Who wants to take that one?
That's a great question, and if everyone had the answer, we probably wouldn't be here. I think people really just have to eventually just get over it, okay? And the way you start getting over is things like this and a dialogue like this. And the way to do it is, I don't know you, you don't know me, I don't know maybe your culture, your background, you don't know mine, I don't know many others, but once you sit down and you really talk to them and you break the ice, then understand why you say what you say, why you do what you do, and maybe you understand why I do what I do. Policeman versus community, if they ever stop to take the chance to talk to each other, and oftentimes it's very difficult. And these police are meeting folks, as the professor said, at a really bad time in their life. When I see people, it's because someone in their family's been killed. It's not a good day. And it's not going to be good several years. And it's a difficult relationship that you have. But eventually, you have to put everything aside and open up your arms and say, okay, I'm going to listen. And that's where I think that it really starts.
Dr. Johnson, what are your thoughts about that?
I think we have to have more transparency. I think we have to do some things to restore the trust or to establish the trust. And really the trust, Hillar mentioned, 35, 40, 50 years ago. If you think about this year, it's 50 years for the Voting Rights Act. And when you think about people of color, African Americans, why did we have to have a Voting Rights Act in 1965? Why couldn't African Americans have that right to vote? Why did we have to have a constitutional amendment for African Americans to vote in this country? So there were some things that have been built up in this country before you guys were born that we really had to come to a point of having some transparency. And I think that law enforcement could help that out a lot because if we could see some separation of responsibilities in terms of who investigate the police officers, and we don't have the police investigating the police, and I know Chief and Hillar may have some issues with that, but I think if we could establish an independent review where we could have people look at it and not have a grand jury make a decision on a police officer that's being presented information by a district attorney who works not with the police but work in connection with the police in terms of law enforcement. So I think that if we all could think about how could we become more transparent, and then people can see that maybe it's not suspicious that police are investigating police and things of that nature, I think we can restore trust that people once had, and I think we can establish trust. Transparency should be the answer to getting us down the road.
Great points you brought up that I want to get back to, but I want to give our audience a chance to get their questions in. Kiyomi, I hope I said that correctly. Your question for the panelists.
My question is, how do you deal with a situation with the police if you have an encounter and you have an incident and you don't feel like it was handled correctly, and you try to go about filing claims, but maybe the police aren't as receptive, and you contact resources and no one's really willing to help you?
Good question.
Well, I mean, if it were me, I would go straight to the head of law enforcement. I'd either go to the sheriff himself, to the chief of police. That's where I would start. And, in this city, I believe you can get an answer from either one of those two. And if you don't, then you have other alternatives that you can explore. But I would start at the top and not start anywhere else.
Well, we have someone who is at the top here, Chief Jackson.
Most definitely. Of course, we're governed under civil service, and to file a formal complaint would be the way to go. And once the complaint is filed, I would have 14 days to launch an investigation on it, look into it, see if any policies or procedures were broken with the case, and then if it was, then I would deem the necessary punishment for that officer.
But what about the feeling that some people might have that if they say or they tell a police officer that they're going to report that they have done something that they feel is unjust, that there may be an intimidation factor there? I mean, how do you, and that's very real. So how do you deal with that? What is the public supposed to do? Well,
it's just like witnessing a crime. And if you sit back and let it go, it's going to happen to someone else. So it starts with the individual. And if you're treated wrong, then 9 times out of 10, that officer is going to go and treat somebody else wrong, and maybe worse. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, it's on the individual, and I think you're well within your rights. I know you're within your rights, mm-hmm. and for that issue to be looked into. So we would have to set aside the fear, mm-hmm. okay? Mm-hmm. And because you do have a head, and you do have consequences. So regarding to the officer. So
let's talk a little bit about that fear. And we happen to have a grandfather and a grandson here with us tonight. Mr. Davis, this is your grandson Tyler. He's 9 years old. And we're talking about the fear that some people feel when they do encounter police officers. And, you know, there is the talk that black families do have with their children, particularly young boys. Is that a talk that you have had to some degree with Tyler, or you plan to have with Tyler as he grows up?
Yes, I've had that conversation with my son. Tyler's our dad, and we'll have the same conversation with Tyler. We have what we believe to be a very good situation in Lafayette with our law enforcement. We have a great relationship with our law enforcement officers, but we venture off into other communities, other cities, other states, and believe that we have to make sure that he knows how to behave when there's an encounter, to make sure that he doesn't do anything behavior-wise that would cause him to be at risk anyway, and to cooperate and to follow the directions and orders of the police officer.
Yes, Missy, you want to comment?
How do we turn, and I love that in the video earlier with Mr. Blache, how do we turn this mistrust or distrust, I love that you said that, into a self-respect instead of being a fear? How do you respect yourself when you are approached by an officer? Not to be aggressive or hostile or whatever. If he's going to arrest me, okay, I screwed up, I sold cigarettes, and just take it and have a self-respect and respect that.
And I think that's along the lines of what, Mr. Davis, you're saying that you're trying to teach your grandson, and that talk that you've had with your son is to not do anything to escalate that situation. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, but I would like to ask the police chief, if you were talking to my grandson, what would you advise him to do when he encounters a police officer?
You know, I would say to Tyler the same way I would tell my son. Whenever you come into contact with a police officer, yes sir, no sir, and just be respectful. All right. If you be respectful, I don't have a problem with my son walking to wherever.
I feel essentially it's a cultural problem, because you have not to label, I mean, African Americans, Hispanics, whites, regardless, seeing the police officers as the aggressor instead of the enforcer, right? So then, as you say, how do you build the trust and respect? That would like to be one of my questions. So is it a education solution? Is it an economic solution? Does it start with the parents? Because that's where all this is coming from. The culture, seeing the officers as the pigs, like the man that murdered the two cops in New York.
In New York. And I like the way you phrased that question. He said some people will see law enforcement as the aggressors rather than the enforcers, perhaps a them against us mentality. So, and that's very real. How do you deal with that? How is that addressed within departments, within law enforcement?
I think it's a two-way street. This is a mutual cycle of distrust. I think we have to admit to ourselves that police officers need training. Police officers need to understand that they are dealing with sometimes unconscious racism. Sometimes we're even dealing with that there is that 1% or smaller conscious racism. I think in statistical study after statistical study after statistical study, what we've seen is that after we correct for all other factors, there is still a factor of racism that affects jury's decisions, prosecutor decisions, and police decisions, as well as decisions in many, many, many other walks of life. So we have to deal with that, and I think we have to deal with it up front, and we have to deal with it forthrightly. We also have to deal with this question not of self-respect, but of self-restraint. And that is a lesson that I fear that all too many of us are forced to teach our children with the talk, that no matter how angry we become, you still have to restrain yourself. It's a circumstance which many of us have to deal with actively, even as adults. But self-restraint, and I think self-examination, those are twin answers.
Well, you brought up some things. You mentioned racism. We talked a little bit about racial profiling. And Stacey, I think that you said something earlier that was very important when you said that there are just some white people who are just completely unaware. Is that, am I saying what you said?
It's not on their radar is all I'm saying. And so that there's obviously this undercurrent of racial tension that is now, you know, on the forefront, and it's on the minds of I would imagine lots and lots of white people who weren't necessarily thinking about it before.
And so if it's not on their radar, and this conversation is a conversation that we need to have, how do we have it in a way that it does move us forward? I know that we have some folks who participated in the Dialogue on Race, which is a wonderful program that deals head-on with race and talking about it in a way that gets you somewhere, that does move the conversation forward. And you had your hand up, so give us some insight. The reason I had my hand raised earlier is because I wanted to say that it does seem to be a race issue, because this is not a conversation that white parents have to have with their kids. I was never told to be careful about how you speak to the police or anything like that. But I think one thing that Dialogue on Race did help me do was to learn how to talk about these issues with people, and especially with other white people, because I do agree that if it's not something you face day to day, I have the privilege of not having to think about my race. And if I don't have to think about it, well, then it doesn't seem to be an issue to me. But for people who do, people that don't have that privilege, it's an everyday reality that they have to face, and they see how it holds them back in their daily lives, or how other people are holding them back because of it. And that needs to be brought to the attention of white people. We need to have our consciousness raised about how our actions, especially when we are in places of power, when we do run institutions, do hold back people of color. And so that's why we need to continue the conversation. I'm hearing from you that it's important to continue the conversation, because that was one of the questions that I had. This is a conversation, this is an ongoing conversation. Sure. Are we getting anywhere? Is it leading anywhere?
Well, we started. The conversation is going on now. I think what we have to do is continue and not let this drop, because I think we're headed there, but we haven't arrived. And as we continue to talk, more and more people will get involved in the process. And I think that brings on what I've been talking about, is transparency, so that individuals then start trusting because they see the public discussions like this.
Okay, let's get to Bill, who is...
We must all learn that hate, prejudice, distrust is learned behavior. Mm-hmm. It's not inborn. We're not born with hate. We're not born with prejudice. We're not born with mistrust. We learn that. Mm-hmm. And from the police perspective and the civilian perspective, that's something we all have to learn to adjust to. You don't understand how it breaks a policeman's heart when he's in the supermarket and a child's misbehaving and the mother wants the officer to put the child in jail. So at 5 years old, there's a fear of the police created by the parent just because the child is just maybe a little loud. But we have to change the perspective about friend, enemy, but behaviors and what's learned and what's inborn and what's not inborn. Mm-hmm. And when I was in law enforcement, before body cameras came out, I installed video cameras in each car.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned body cameras.
But it was to keep officers in line, not to catch them doing things wrong, but if they did, the evidence was there for me to correct it immediately.
Right. Well, let's talk about this issue of body cameras, because as we saw in our survey, a whopping 97% of the people who were surveyed believe that it is a good idea to use body cameras. Chief, what do you think about body cameras?
I'm a big fan of it. The challenging thing is cost. Of course, in law enforcement, I always said when I retire, I'm going to sell something to the police because it makes money. But transparency there again. If you have that set of eyes, then, it'll cut back. It'll keep your officer in line. It'll cut back on complaints against officers, especially if the person you're dealing with know that they're being recorded.
Sure.
So it's a two-way street. It's just the cost and downloading and other issues. But once we get past that, then yes, I'm in full compliance with it, and I'll agree with it wholeheartedly.
And Hillar, as a district attorney?
Not really a big fan of police cameras. Here in Baton Rouge, you have 500 to 700 police officers and then 700 deputies. So you're going to put a camera on all of those bodies. Why not put them on the public defender? Why not put them on the district attorney? Why not put them on the judge? They're all part of the system. Mm-hmm. These police officers, right now in Baton Rouge, with the Baton Rouge Police Department, you can tell when the police officer hits his gas, you can tell his speed, you can have when he hits his brakes, when he puts on his blinker, it's all captured in a computer. When he stops someone, he turns on his lights, the camera backs up 20 seconds. Everything is videoed inside those cars. Now you want to put a camera on his body. When he stops someone, goes to talk to someone that wants to give him information, can he turn the camera off? Is it going to be recorded? A sexual assault victim, what are you going to do when he gets out the car with that victim? Down the road, when everybody wants to file a public records request, who's going to sit behind those gazillion computers and download all of this data that may be private information? And who's going to filter through what's given out, what's not given out? And the cities that have these body cameras are faced with this situation now where there's so much data, so much information, they can't afford the people to sit behind a computer to just comply with the
but you
public
may
records request.
you may be able to dispute eyewitness account, but how can you dispute what's caught on camera?
Well, what's caught on camera with both ways.
Both ways.
Yeah, both
yes,
ways.
Both ways.
Surely that's I think you have to factor. I mean, what you're doing is you're saying that by cameras, you're saying the police are wrong. The police are not always wrong.
Right.
Police are normally right the most of the occasions. So we focusing on the police as the problem. The police are not the problem. This is a community problem. And like this gentleman, Tyler has a Tyler has a family. And the police are not going to, and law enforcement is not going to solve problems in this community. It's going to be from the bottom up, not from the top down. As the professor's law review article sort of states, it has to be from the ground up. And so we have to look at this as a community issue, not a police. It's not always the police problem.
But let me stop you right there. No, it's not always a police problem, but even the chief says that there's a problem. So admit that there is a problem and then work on that problem. No, it's not all one side's fault or all the other side's fault, but both sides perhaps are at fault, right?
Absolutely, and I think both sides have to recognize that and state, hey, we've not always done things correctly.
Yeah.
And both sides. And now let's move on from where we are and make it better.
Yeah.
But absolutely, that's part of it.
What about body cameras? Dr. Johnson.
Well, I mean, we hear it both ways. It's good, but then you have to look at the cost. But I see those being effects and not dealing with the cause of the problem, because we can go further and further out with dealing with effects, the results. But I think we need to deal with the root cause of the problem. We need to have more community meetings like this. We need to have conversations between law enforcement and the community, because when you have police in the community rather than community policing, where you have the police officers walking the beat and know who the people are, I think familiarity brings about relationships. People are talking, and I think information is shared because they know each other. But when you have police officers from one community, police in another community, see, that goes back to part of that distrust. Because if you're in Baton Rouge and you got a police officer from Denham Springs over in the park, which is 70805, does that police officer know the people in the park? How can we? I mean, if we just dumb down on the whole thing and say, what really are we looking at in terms of public safety, law enforcement, enforcing the laws? And I think that if communities and elected officials, more than anything, people can talk, but if the legislators won't change the law, if the local elected officials won't change the law, we got what we got, and it's not going to change. But people vote. And if we get more people interested in the problems and voting, and we can get these vote numbers up past 30% to 50, 60, the 90-some% of people who like body cams, if they voted for the elected officials that got the body cams, we would have them.
Yeah.
And so I think it comes back to community involvement and letting our people know that we have to participate in government, and the way the citizens participate in government is going out to vote.
Let's talk about the military. Oh, yes, Gabrielle. Yes, you have a question.
I have a question for the chief. I know you said that you were in favor of the body cameras. Would you possibly see any problems arising dealing with privacy for both the officer and the citizen?
It's a great question.
Good question.
If you put the proper policy in place, then I would say no. Do I expect you to wear your camera 12 hours? No. But when you're dealing with someone, when you're approaching someone, you need to hit the button, okay, and turn the camera on. It's for your safety as well as theirs. So I think if we have the proper policy to put in place of why we need this data or this particular film, then we can do well with it. And I understand Hillar's point.
Let me ask you this too, because we were talking about, body cameras, and I asked the question at the very top: who polices the police? Who polices the police? And how do you feel about a special prosecutor being assigned to handle cases involving police officers who shoot civilians? You're shaking your head.
I disagree with it totally.
And why is that?
We have a justice system in place. We have laws in place already, and it ranges from justifiable homicide all the way to negligent homicide. Okay, somebody like Hillar Moore is very capable of charging or prosecuting someone that has committed a homicide that's not justifiable, in other words. So if he know how to charge these people, any other civilian, then we fall in the same line. I tell people all the time, we're just as responsible for shooting or killing someone versus a regular civilian that's doing it in self-defense.
There were a lot of questions raised about how the case was handled in Ferguson and what that DA did versus what normally happens when a case goes before a grand jury. Can you touch on that just a little bit about the process, how things happen there a little bit differently than perhaps they normally do?
I'm not sure whether it was really different there or not, but you, as a DA, you feel pain for another DA when you see him in that situation. It's not a pleasant situation to handle. But from what I can tell, and I'm surely not an expert on that case, but it seemed to me that he was trying to present every witness that he could present, whether it was a lying witness or a truthful witness, letting the grand jury decide this is what this person says. You weigh that person's credibility. You make the decision. And remember, a grand jury doesn't put anyone in jail, doesn't convict anybody. A grand jury just looks at the evidence that's presented to them and determines whether the evidence, if uncontroverted, goes forward, is there enough to charge this officer or this person in any particular type of case. And that's what grand juries do, and that's what I understand that he was attempting to do.
But normally, does that happen? Do you put everything on that you have?
Normally on cases, you don't present every witness that you have because you want to protect victims in rape cases, and you have an officer testify as to what the victim would say. But in this case, if I had to do this case, I would present every witness so that the grand jury had a full range of what happened and who said what position they were in, and let that grand jury decide.
And that's what happened in
let
this
that
case.
grand jury decide.
Professor
What do you
Diamond,
think should happen?
what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not a district attorney, but I would not have done what the DA did in St. Louis County. It strikes me that what was done there was far outside of the norm, as I understand what goes on in a grand jury presentation. The district attorney is not in the business ordinarily of presenting defenses, for example, for a defendant. Moreover, I'll make another suggestion. What we had in Ferguson was a prime example of why special prosecutors would be advisable in sensitive cases. Just as we had a special prosecutor when Richard Nixon was being accused of crime, as we had in the federal jurisdiction, because there were questions about whether prosecutors could be trusted. We have those questions today about whether prosecutors can be trusted. And I think in a situation where we demand trust, we demand transparency, it seems to me that special prosecutors who are beholden not to the electorate, not to a relationship with the police, special prosecutors can serve a very good purpose.
Okay, the militarization of police. I want to get to that. And Marvin, you have that question, right?
Yes, I did. So I guess my question for anyone who wants to answer on the panel, with the militarization of police in Ferguson and cases like the North Miami Beach, when they're using mugshots of black youth for target practice, to help that transparency, like you guys have mentioned, what is the Louisiana law enforcement doing to sorry, I'm trying to blank on the question.
That's okay. But the militarization of police, I mean, we're seeing this all around, and very quickly, where do you all stand on that? Do you think that this is a viable option for police departments to be given access to military equipment, surplus military equipment, and use it in the way that we saw in Ferguson, which really brought it to light? Very quickly, Chief.
My thoughts. Policing is very complicated these days. We have a lot of challenges that we face. And when things go down, we want to equip our guys with whatever tools they need that's necessary.
And so you're in favor of it?
To a certain point, yes.
Dr. Johnson?
Well, no, I'm not in favor of it. Why? If we were dealing with the root cause and establishing relationships in the community, why should we in America have militarization of the police department? I mean, I think we're going in the wrong direction. We need to put the brakes on, and we need to back up and get some common sense involved in this process. And I kind of disagree with my two friends here about having special prosecutor, because part of that transparency is that the district attorney works with the police on a regular basis to prosecute crimes and everything else. And I don't think we should put them in that kind of position. They're not going to come out and say don't do it, but I think we, the citizens, need to call for some independent review. In New Orleans, I was in New Orleans this past week, and there's an independent police review down there that the citizens voted on, that go in and investigate whatever police actions are going on. So I think that we really need to start thinking about it. Excuse me, the law won't allow it because the law doesn't allow for a special prosecutor, but it's up to the people. And as Abraham Lincoln said one time, it's not the courts, it's not the Congress, it's the people. And the people really got to get involved in this conversation as to what we would like to do as citizens to resolve some of these issues.
And believe it or not, we are out of time. And I so appreciate you all being here tonight, sharing your thoughts and your insight, all of you, for a fantastic conversation. We'd like to thank everyone, our panelists, Chief Jackson, Dr. Johnson, Attorney Moore, and Professor Diamond, for their insights on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
Well, Shauna, we didn't have enough time to get to all of the questions, but it was a very intense and good conversation.
It was, and a conversation that will continue, as our audience said.
Well, I certainly always think that everyone would do well if you were all on camera all the time. That's what I tell my children, family, friends. You know, it makes you behave properly.
That's right.
Well, that's all the time we have, though, for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. While you're there, take this month's survey, view additional sound bites, and comment on tonight's show. We would love to hear from you. And to learn more about civil rights in Louisiana, please take a tour of the new Louisiana Digital Media Archives website at ladigitalmedia.org. More than 1,500 video clips from LPB and the state archives are stored there waiting to be explored.
Now, February's show takes a look at another major topic, oil prices. Crude oil prices have fallen over the last 6 months from $110 per barrel to below $50. Some analysts predict a drop to below $40. What do lower oil and gas prices mean for the state? Louisiana Public Square looks for answers next month on dollars per barrel, oil prices, and Louisiana. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
Great job, guys.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.